afternoon. Paul D. Moreno holds the William and Bernice Grucock Chair in Constitutional History at Hillsdale College and is the Director of Academic Programs at the college's Kirby Center. He received his BA from the State University of New York and his MA and PhD in History at the University of Maryland. In addition to teaching at Hillsdale for 13 years, he has held visiting professorships at Princeton University and the University of Paris School of Law. He is the author of Black Americans and Organized Labor, A New History and the American State from the Civil War to the New Deal, The Twilight of Constitutionalism and the Triumph of Progressivism, forthcoming. Please join me in welcoming to the podium Dr. Paul Moreno.
Thank you, Portia and David, for that nice introduction. I'm glad you could all be here the day after the snow quester. I just moved out here from Michigan, and I thought it was amusing the way in which people responded to the threat of a couple of inches of snow. As David mentioned, I'm a historian, and so the story, or a series of stories I want to tell this afternoon, is how the defining feature of what we call progressivism, or modern liberalism, has been the use of public power to serve private interests, particularly to reduce competition and to establish cartels. Simply put, a cartel is an effort by competitors in the same line of work to agree not to compete. As Adam Smith put it, men of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment or diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. A familiar cartel example would be OPEC, where oil producers openly set production quotas in order to maintain an agreed-upon price for their product. Major League Baseball is everyone's favorite legally sanctioned cartel. The New York Yankees and the Boston Red Sox may compete on the field, but the front offices are in cahoots. This is, of course, the most common phenomenon in human politics. It is the problem of faction that James Madison described in the 10th Federalist. It goes back to the classical foundations of Western political thought. In Aristotle, for example, who defined a true polity or a right constitution as one that governs for the good of the whole and not for a part. But in the 20th century, progressives and modern liberals abandoned the constitutional restraints that were meant to work against factional politics. Instead, government became the propagator and overseer of a faction-based system. And Madison is perversely often credited or accused of legitimizing faction in the 10th Federalist. But that legitimation came from the 20th century progressives. They made a virtue of what Madison still regarded as a vice, an inescapable one, but still a vice, of republics. Antitrust law is a good example of this phenomenon. Though most people, or at least people who are aware that there is such a thing as antitrust law, think that those laws are supposed to prevent monopolies or cartels, these laws have more often been used to protect small local monopolies against larger, more efficient competitors. The late Robert Bork did pioneering work in this field, describing American antitrust law as a policy at war with itself. Congress has never been clear whether the law was meant to foster competition for the benefit of consumers or to maximize the number of competitors for the benefit of small businesses. The Supreme Court recovered this legislative punt and ran it in a consumer benefit direction. In 1911, it ruled that the first Sherman Antitrust Act only outlawed unreasonable combinations in restraint of trade. Small business advocates then got Congress to create the Federal Trade Commission in 1914, which outlawed unfair methods of competition, something more, it was hoped, than what earlier antitrust laws had outlawed. Small business partisans hoped that the commission would prevent anyone from becoming too big, rather than controlling them after they had already become too big. Their chief theorist was Louis D. Brandeis, the progressive lawyer who would later join the Supreme Court. Brandeis believed that big business only came about via unfair and unethical methods, never as a result of greater efficiency. For Brandeis, bigness was like a cancer, always the sign of malignancy. It harmed shareholders, honest competitors, and consumers all at once. He called this the curse of bigness. Since Congress was unable to define and specify the nefarious methods that produced bigness, it left this to an independent commission. And the same thing is happening right now in the DoddFrank Act's creation of a Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that will prosecute and punish abusive lending practices. And nobody knows what abusive means. Congress has left the agency to define the offense that it will then prosecute and punish. But the antitrust laws and the Federal Trade Commission had little impact. Though there have been periods when the Justice Department, the FTC, and the courts have made mergers and acquisitions more difficult, over the long run, they've done little to influence the industrial structure of the United States. With one notable exception, banking, which I'll talk about in a minute, the U.S. looks much like the rest of the industrialized world, where a small number of large firms dominate certain industries that naturally enjoy what economists call economies of scale and other such benefits. One interesting chapter of the antitrust story was its impact on labor unions. Labor unions had long acted like conspiracies in restraint of trade and were thus the proper subjects of antitrust law. Unions are cartels whose goal is to reduce output, labor, and to raise prices, wages. Their methods, strikes and boycotts, were also usually illegal or conducted in illegal ways. In its early years, the antitrust laws were more effective against labor than against producer organizations. This led the American Federation of Labor to undertake a campaign to have unions exempted from the antitrust laws, which it had largely achieved in the 1930s. American banking policy also illustrates the cartel-promoting phenomenon. We hear a lot today about how federal policy abets financial institutions that are too big to fail and harm small, local, or community banks. There's a great deal of truth in this, but it is also true that historically, smaller state banks have used government power to insulate themselves from larger out-of-state competitors. This is largely the product of our peculiar federal system and the suspicion about federal involvement in banking that goes back to Jefferson and Hamilton and the first Bank of the United States. It took a very long time for the U.S. to get any kind of central bank. And although banking today is more concentrated than ever, American banking is still a lot less concentrated than most other advanced economies. Not only did national policy protect state banking monopolies, but states often protected county or unit banks by doing things like outlawing branch banking. Large banks did their best to end these restrictions. A century and a half ago, New York bankers hoped that the National Currency Act would give them an advantage over state banks. But even after Congress taxed state banknotes out of existence, small state banks rebounded and outnumbered national banks by the end of the 19th century. A century ago, progressives, again led by Louis Brandeis, claimed that a Wall Street money trust abetted industrial monopolies. But American banking was actually becoming less centralized before the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913. Indeed, there's considerable evidence that the big bank creators of the Fed hoped that the new system would relieve them from small bank competition. That is to say, what we call progressivism was really corporate liberalism, or sometimes called crony capitalism. To some degree, the Fed did help large banks, especially after the Great Depression, which hit the financial industry with another wave of regulation. Banks were among the first institutions that the Hoover administration and the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the mother of all bailouts, considered too big to fail. Banking remained very concentrated and uncompetitive for several decades after the Depression, when the goals of security and equality prevailed over those of innovation and growth. These mid-century years were the ones of greater income equality, strong unions, and confiscatory tax rates, which progressives today would like to return to. Banking was reduced to what was called a simple 3-6-3 formula. You borrow at 3%, lend at 6%, and you're on the golf course at 3 o'clock. President John F. Kennedy promised to get the country moving again in 1960, and he appointed James J. Saxon as comptroller of the currency, who warned of over-regulation in the banking industry. But significant financial service deregulation didn't come until the 1970s and 1980s, and concentration reached a low point around 1990. In an industry so highly regulated as banking, it's hard to say what level of concentration would result from the operation of unfettered market forces. But clearly we see a history that has veered between a concern with the curse of bigness and one that has produced institutions that are too big to fail. Many of us are familiar with the fact that traditional constitutional limitations on federal power have been evaded by an expansive definition of Congress's power to tax and to regulate commerce among the states. It is worthy of note that the development of these powers, what used to be called a federal police power, resulted from the same kind of anti-competitive cartelizing that I've been discussing. Historians have shown that a great deal of progressive legislation that claimed to protect the people, or the little guys, against the interests, or big business, were in fact supported by the interests themselves. The Pure Food and Drugs Act of 1906 arose from attempts to eliminate competition from new food products. Sugar producers condemned glucose, an artificial sweetener developed in Napoleonic France. Straight whiskey distillers wanted relief from cheaper blended whiskeys, have them defined as adulterated food products. Cream of tartar producers sought to demonize acid-based or alum baking powders. The Royal Baking Company, for example, denounced alum as a dangerous drug and pictured phosphate as being made from old bones covered with vitriol, and it appealed to mothers to protect their family's health by using pure cream of tartar baking powder. And they falsely reported that an entire Pennsylvania family had died from eating bread made with a competitor's baking powder. When margarine, or oleomargarine as it was then called, was invented as a butter substitute in the 1860s, American dairy farmers clamored for suppression of this new rival. They claimed that oleo was dangerous to health, or that it was colored yellow and fraudulently sold as butter. Several states prohibited its manufacture and sale altogether. The New York Court of Appeals struck down an Oleo Prohibition Act in 1885. While the state could certainly enact safeguards against fraud, the court said, it could not absolutely prohibit oleo to drive the substituted article from the market and protect those engaged in the manufacture of dairy products against the competition of cheaper substitutes. But the U.S. Supreme Court upheld Pennsylvania's oleo prohibition. Justice John Marshall Harlan emphasized that every possible presumption would be given to the legislature in its exercise of the police power. As such laws were unnecessarily oppressive, the oppressed must resort to the polls, not to the court. Justice Stephen Field dissented, claiming that the 14th Amendment protected the natural right to seek and produce food, by which life can be preserved and enjoyed, in all ways not encroaching upon the equal right of others. He remarked that the legislature should have extended congratulations and reward, rather than prohibition, to the manufacturers of this salubrious foodstuff. He could imagine no greater invasion of the rights of the citizen than this oleo prohibition. In 1886, Congress enacted an excise tax on oleo. The hearings were described as little more than a witch hunt, in which oleo opponents claimed that it was manufactured from dead dogs, mad dogs, and drowned sheep. The bill's proponents virtually admitted that it was a piece of what was then called class legislation. One Iowa representative noted that agrarian states had supported the tariff, though it benefited eastern manufacturing states. If the protectionists of the East stand loyally by the interests of the farmers, the law of reciprocity will not be forgotten by the representatives who now ask for assistance. Log rolling is very rarely expressed so openly as it was in this case. The dairymen preferred a 10-cent per pound tax to drive oleo out of the market, but Congress enacted a milder 2-cent tax and required manufacturers and sellers to purchase federal licenses and clearly package and label their product as oleo. The Nation magazine, then was very conservative, commented that the act established the principle that Congress possesses the power to pass an act discriminating in favor of one domestic industry as against another, and was a plain violation of the spirit of the Constitution. President Grover Cleveland reluctantly signed the bill. In what we today would call a signing statement, he told Congress that if he had been truly convinced that the Revenue Act was really a pretext to destroy one industry of our people for the protection and benefit of another, he would have vetoed the bill. But the tax established oleo as a legitimate article of interstate commerce, preventing butter states from stopping imports from oleo states. Some states then required oleo to be colored pink or blue, but the court struck these acts down. Dairy interests returned to Congress for further relief. Debate in Congress over a new 1902 oleo tax was extensive and at times sophisticated. Many members were clearly aware of the constitutional issues at stake. Ultimately, the view that prevailed was expressed by Maryland Representative William H. Jackson. "This government, sir, is all-powerful," he said. "This government is the people, and the people can do anything with their government that they desire. This is an age of progress." And it was exactly at this time, at the turn of the century, that the progressive movement began to turn and have this view of the sovereign power of the federal government. The court upheld the new oleo tax. Justice White observed that Congress's power to enact such an excise is so completely established as to require only statement. But few precedents concern the use of a federal excise to eliminate a product from the market. The clearest parallel example was the elimination of state banknotes during the Civil War, which White admitted was done under the federal currency power. He further admitted that the Constitution established limits to the taxing power. A tax, he said, so extreme as to be beyond the principles which we have previously stated, not for revenue, but solely for the purpose of destroying rights which could not be rightfully destroyed, consistently with the principles of freedom and justice upon which the Constitution rests, would be unconstitutional. 3 justices dissented, but unfortunately without opinion. The consumer interest ultimately prevailed, for the law had little impact on the oleo industry. There were ways around the tax that Congress imposed. And though the dairy industry, you could say, lost this effort, it did establish taxation as an important basis for an emerging federal police power. It was later applied to outlaw phosphorus matches, opium, and other narcotics. The Great Depression amplified calls for government relief from economic competition. President Herbert Hoover, himself a progressive, though still often depicted as the last of the laissez-faire reactionaries, helped create the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. The RFC was the original bailout program for businesses that were too big to fail. It resurrected the War Finance Corporation of World War I, which had only recently expired. The RFC did what the Federal Reserve Board had failed to do, providing a lender of last resort for banks and public utilities. Critics easily derided the agency as a millionaire's dole. Nebraska progressive George Norris jeered, saying, "I have been called a socialist, but in the wildest flights of my imagination, I never thought of such a thing." Hoover didn't want to recommend the agency, but early in 1932, it escaped his political ability to resist it, and the RFC did become notoriously politicized and corrupt. The most ambitious attempt to cartelize the American economy came in the New Deal period under the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933. The NIRA was a modified version of a plan by General Electric President Gerard Swope to suspend the antitrust laws and allow trade associations to regulate themselves. President Hoover rejected the plan as the promotion of price fixing and gigantic trusts and called it essentially fascist. The Roosevelt administration accepted its basic outline, though made significant modifications to it. The act permitted trade associations to write their own codes of fair competition for their industries with the president's approval. And the president could also impose a code on an industry or limit businesses to those to whom he issued licenses. The act did not explicitly permit price fixing, but it practically invited it. The act stipulated that the codes are not designed to promote monopolies or to eliminate or oppress small enterprises, but this is what it ultimately ended up doing. It also provided an important guarantee that workers could join unions. The NIRA reflected the progressive belief that government could regulate or limit competition without promoting monopoly, or, to put it another way, that it could promote the right kinds of monopolies. Small business cartels, as well as cartels for farmers or workers, but not big industrial monopolies. President Roosevelt explained to Congress that the antitrust laws were meant to prevent giant monopolies, not to foster cutthroat or ruinous competition. The Recovery Act represented a marriage of business price fixing and labor price fixing. United Mine Workers President John L. Lewis urged Congress to give both management and labor a closed shop. Socialist Party leader Norman Thomas denounced the act as a complete denial of the bases of the old capitalism, a capitalist syndicalism, in essence fascist. Many Senate progressives, led by William Borah, opposed the act. Robert Wagner of New York claimed that it was the only way to realize the original purpose of the antitrust laws. This act also represented a colossal delegation of legislative power to the president, one that Congress was willing to accept. Texas Representative Sam Rayburn said, "It is very true that under this bill, the president is made a dictator over industry for the time being, but it is a benign dictatorship. For my part, I am proud to trust him and proud to follow him." Roosevelt aptly called the NIRA the most important and far-reaching legislation ever enacted by an American Congress. Simultaneously, the Agricultural Adjustment Act tried to do the same thing for farmers, allowing them to agree on production limits that would raise prices for their crops, even to the point of killing millions of piglets to raise pork prices and plowing under a third of the 1933 cotton crop. And if you know anything about farm policy, that would be another good illustration of what I'm talking about, a program that was supposed to be about preserving small farmers. Most of the benefits end up going to agribusiness. Nevertheless, the NIRA quickly disappointed the public and organized labor in particular. Though the National Recovery Administration, the agency that administered the act, was commonly depicted as having been captured by businesses opposed its extension, and the NRA consistently supported organized labor. The NRA faced an impossible task of trying to reconcile irreconcilable policies. Again, we see a policy at war with itself, as Robert Bork put it. To protect small businesses, but not to promote monopoly. To restore employment while promoting unions, and to raise producer prices and increase consumption at the same time. The Justice Department's antitrust prosecutions ran into cartel plans approved by the Recovery Agency. Meat packers on reduced code hours couldn't slaughter the glut of condemned Agricultural Adjustment Act piglets quickly enough. And in March 1934, Roosevelt established a National Recovery Review Board to investigate complaints. Clarence Darrow headed it and roundly condemned the administration. Roosevelt later complained that the board proceeded rather as a prosecuting attorney to prove a case against business rather than as an impartial review board. NRA officials denounced Darrow as the mouthpiece of chiselers and sweatshop operators. The NIRA was so outlandish that the Supreme Court struck it down unanimously, with even the most liberal justices on board. The administration had long avoided trying to enforce the act criminal sanctions because it doubted its constitutionality. Now it ended up in a ridiculous posture defending the Recovery Act in a trivial case. The Schechter brothers ran a small kosher slaughtering business in Brooklyn and were accused of violating the live poultry code. One charge involved selling an unfit chicken. And to this day, the case, Schechter versus the United States, is referred to as the sick chicken case. But even more revealing was the code's prohibition of straight killing, or more accurately, straight selling, which forbade sellers to allow customers to choose particular chickens, forcing them to accept whatever fowls occupied a coop or a half coop. Again, this is all about protecting producer rather than consumer interests. Sustained laughter punctuated the oral argument as the justices considered the implications of such rules. Chief Justice Hughes, for unanimous court, invalidated the NIRA. The entire act unconstitutionally delegated legislative powers to the president, who in turn delegated them to private interest groups. Such a delegation of legislative power is unknown to our law and is utterly inconsistent with the constitutional prerogatives and duties of Congress, Hughes wrote. The act supplies no standards for any trade, industry, or activity. Instead of prescribing rules of conduct, it authorizes the making of codes to prescribe them. And again, this was the high point and indeed the only point of what's referred to as the non-delegation doctrine. The court had never before said that an act violated that principle, and it never will again. Moreover, the Schechters' business was entirely intrastate, without any semblance of a direct effect on interstate commerce. Hughes noted that this distinction was essential to the maintenance of our constitutional system. Without it, there would be no limits to Congress's legislative power. With these fatal objections, the court did not need to consider whether the act also violated the Due Process Clause. Even Justice Cardozo concurred, saying that the act was delegation running riot and one that threatened to end our federal system. Killing the NIRA was especially gratifying to Justice Brandeis. He told one of the principal drafters of New Deal legislation, "This is the end of this business of centralization, and I want you to go back and tell the president that we're not going to let this government centralize everything. It's come to an end. The president has been living in a fool's paradise." Brandeis urged the New Dealers to go home, back to the states. That is where they must do their work. As it turned out, the New Dealers would find plenty of work at both the state and the national level. After FDR threatened to pack the Supreme Court in 1937, the court dropped its objections to both federal and state rent-seeking. Though the administration didn't resurrect anything as comprehensive as the NIRA, it did enact laws to promote cartels in more targeted industries. Organized labor, for example, got the National Labor Relations Act. Coal mining companies and the United Mine Workers limited production and raised prices in coal. A new Agricultural Adjustment Act was enacted for growers of certain commodities. The trucking industry got the Motor Carrier Act, limiting entry into that industry and also providing relief for railroads from trucking competition. When the old Supreme Court had struck down both federal and state economic restrictions, FDR complained that it created what he called a no man's land of anarchical business depredation. Now, with both the federal government and the states enjoying an unfettered police power, the no man's land had become a zone of concurrent regulatory power. As political scientist Jane Perry Clark noted in 1938, not all federal development has been at the expense of the states. For government as a whole, federal, state, and local, has surged ceaselessly forward. It thus weakened the system of competitive federalism by which the Constitution discouraged the seeking of class legislation. And law professor Michael Grieva has described this in his new book, The Upside Down Constitution, very, very thoroughly. It is certainly clear that the 1930s witnessed an orgy of class legislation as interest groups mobilized to take advantage of new regulatory freedom. Louisiana restricted the issuing of riverboat pilot licenses to blood relatives of incumbent pilots. Michigan restricted bartending to males. And Colorado criminalized activity that tended to or had the effect of bringing into disrepute the state's dry cleaning price fixing act. In the late 19th century, courts had frustrated the efforts of plumbers to control entry into their trade. Now, boards of wallpaper hangers, photographers, and watchmakers were able to control entry into their professions. While some state courts kept due process alive in a rearguard action to preserve occupational freedom, the U.S. Supreme Court fled the economic field and adopted a new agenda, that of protecting non-property or personal rights and the rights of what it called discrete and insular minorities. But commercial or business regulation was an open field. The last phenomenon I'd like to discuss is how the Supreme Court helped to promote local monopoly power by abandoning its power to fashion a common law in matters of interstate commerce. One of the problems that the Constitution meant to remedy was interstate discrimination. States sought to protect their local economies from outside competition. The founders tried to prevent such balkanization by a number of constitutional provisions, including giving the federal courts jurisdiction in suits between citizens of different states. This is known as diversity jurisdiction and was meant to provide out-of-state defendants with a neutral federal forum to escape local bias against them. In the Judiciary Act of 1789, Congress directed the federal courts to use the laws of the states in diversity cases. But in 1842, in the case of Swift versus Tyson, the Supreme Court held that state common law rules in areas like contracts and torts did not bind the federal courts, which were free to develop their own rules from general principles of commercial jurisprudence, a kind of natural law jurisprudence. The federal judiciary thus greatly facilitated the development of a nationwide free market by mitigating the hostility of local businesses and juries. Congress supported this movement and expanded the federal court's diversity jurisdiction throughout the 19th century. Complaints soon arose, though, especially in the less industrialized South and the West, that the federal courts had given northeastern corporations a privileged position. The populists, and then the progressives, called for redressing or eliminating federal diversity jurisdiction. They cited cases like Baltimore and Ohio Railroad against Baugh in 1893, in which the Supreme Court overturned Ohio's more plaintiff-friendly standard in industrial accident cases and held that injured workers could not recover if their fellow servant had contributed to the accident. But decisions like this were exceptional, though the progressives depicted them as being the rule. Indeed, federal courts sometimes use more plaintiff-friendly rules than state courts. But progressives like Felix Frankfurter persisted in claiming that federal diversity jurisdiction had been mischievous in its consequences, he said, baffling in its application, and untenable in theory, and contrary to the intent of the framers of the Constitution and the First Judiciary Act. Behind the scenes, progressive legal academics hoped to use tort litigation as a means of economic redistribution. They wanted the courts to devise a system of social insurance, using the more powerful and wealthy corporations to subsidize the weak and poor through lawsuits. The ethics of the legal profession turned from shunning to celebrating ambulance chasing. The change came suddenly and unexpectedly in 1938 in an opinion by Justice Brandeis, the darling of the progressives who Woodrow Wilson had put on the court. Brandeis argued that Swift, the doctrine of federal common law, had produced mischievous results and grave discrimination by non-citizens or large out-of-state corporations against citizens, small local interests. The doctrine, though followed for the last 96 years, was not only misguided, he said, but unconstitutional, this being the only time that the court has declared one of its own decisions unconstitutional. Brandeis and the progressives had accused corporations of what's known as forum shopping, moving their cases to more defendant-friendly federal courts. But his decision encouraged forum shopping by plaintiffs, keeping their cases in jurisdictions more likely to award large damage judgments against big business. The Supreme Court also adopted a new set of rules of civil procedure in 1938, which made it easier for plaintiffs to bring suit in federal court and to turn the pretrial discovery process into a fishing expedition. In the ensuing decades, plaintiff lawyers came to depict themselves as crusaders for social justice, using the lawsuit to promote equality and to vindicate the rights of the poor and women and minorities and consumers against irresponsible corporations. Indeed, tort plaintiffs, they said, acted like private attorney generals, achieving public good through their private lawsuits. Lawyers began to advertise and to bring mass tort class action suits against manufacturers of asbestos and silicone breast implants and ultimately the tobacco industry. Thus, the legal system contributed to a social and cultural movement that devalued individual responsibility, blamed society for all problems, and focused on victimhood. By the 1980s, it was increasingly apparent that the litigation system had gotten out of control. Stories of outrageous lawsuits abounded. The most famous was the story of the woman who sued McDonald's after she spilled hot coffee on herself. Others included a woman who won a $1.6 million judgment against a phone book company that had led her to a physician who botched her liposuction surgery. Another was a student who sued his school for stress caused by summer homework, and a city employee who backed his dump truck into his own car and then sued the city. Such suits provided material for innumerable lawyer jokes among late-night TV comics and talk radio hosts. The economic effects of the litigation explosion were significant. Litigation costs grew at 4 times the rate of the economy since 1930, amounting to 2% of the national income. Average tort awards in Cook County in Chicago rose in inflation-adjusted terms from $52,000 to $1.2 million between 1960 and 1984. By 1990, it was estimated that the tort law system cost the country $300 billion a year. The plaintiff bar took in $40 billion in 2002. Plaintiffs themselves netted only about half of that amount of judgments after paying lawyers' fees and other costs. And the indirect costs of increased liability raised prices for everyone and thus inhibited innovation and economic growth. As a West Virginia Supreme Court justice put it, much of my time is devoted to ways to make business pay for everyone else's bad luck. American law had originally tried to compensate injured victims, to restore them to their condition before the injury, while also deterring bad and irresponsible behavior by not rewarding the negligent. Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. put it in his 1881 classic, The Common Law, "The general principle of our law is that loss from accident must lie where it falls." As another observer put it, ideally nobody would be liable to anyone for anything. Since 1938, we've replaced that with a system in which everyone is liable to everyone for everything. This is, again, typical of the way that the progressives have reshaped American law in the policy in the private law sector, that we had started out forming governments to get us out of the state of nature, the war of every man against every man, as Hobbes put it. But what I've been describing over the past century, our state builders have brought us back into that state of nature, and I think the private litigation system is a good illustration of that. So let me conclude there and ask if you have any questions. Elliot.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Moreno. It's been a while since I've heard the microphone. I'm curious as to, as this sort of Hobbesian sort of status moves along, where everyone against everyone through this legal system, where lawyers sort of are men at arms for hire and courts are just ways to bludgeon your enemies. What sort of ideas historically have been suggested, and what do you think has some constitutional merit to be able to move back toward that constitutionalism?
Well, I think one of the most important, a lot of the important safeguards that prevented this were sort of internal, social, cultural, and even religious, in ways that I think the founders of the Constitution, as John Adams put it, our Constitution is only going to work for a particular kind of people. Unless there is some sort of social capital, some degree of virtue in the people, the Constitution isn't going to be enough to prevent this sort of thing. So that when the constitutional restrictions began to break down at the same time that those moral, social, cultural limitations also began to give way, they had a mutually reinforcing effect. The question is always in my field of legal or constitutional history is, do laws make culture, or is law simply the reflection of the culture? Well, they're reciprocal and they're reinforcing. And what I think you see now is that when people begin to see that everyone's doing it, right? The stigma against certain kinds of behavior erodes to the point where you no longer have that internal individual resistance. Who wants to be the last person who's actually, let's say, honest in the way they fill out their income taxes, right? The income tax system is just so perverse that, it practically encourages otherwise honest and decent people to do things that are, they know are kind of dishonest. And the system has, I think, this tendency of rewarding bad behavior. How do you turn that around is both institutionally, both through formal means, but also in a way, pray about this. Yes, sir.
Do you think that Adams would today think we have the term you use, social capital? Do you think he would say that we're the type of people that can maintain a democracy? Not to put you on the spot or anything, but
No, I don't think he would. And in fact, many of the framers themselves, it was even in their own lifetimes that they began to doubt whether the experiment that they had launched could succeed. By the time that they died, many of the founders believed that this was not going to work out. That America had become too obsessed with equality. By the time of the Jacksonians, many of them began to despair for the whole system. John Marshall did. Jefferson apparently is the only founder who died sort of just as optimistic as he had been through his whole life. So Adams himself, I think, would have been a doubtful. On the other hand, his son ended up becoming part of the system and president himself. And I think the next generation believed that they could redeem the system. I think Lincoln's a good example of that, right? Seeing especially the way in which avarice and the lust for power that he saw in the system of slavery didn't despair, but rather believed that within the Constitution there was a way of turning things around, and was able to do so. Sir.
So you're not an economist, you're a historian, but I will ask you a question about economics anyway. What do you think explains the higher rates of GDP growth from the mid-1930s to the mid-1970s and the slower rates of GDP growth since the mid-1970s?
Oh, well, actually, there's some, if you look at the rates of economic growth in the post-New Deal period, right? The 1950s, for example, are usually seen as a period of great prosperity. Now, this is the period of great expansion of the American middle class and suburbanization and the sort of flowering of a consumer culture and all that. Economic growth in the 50s was actually slow, less by historical standards than had been before the New Deal. So it was widespread, the prosperity of the 1950s, but the actual overall economic growth was slow. I think there's differences before and after 1913, when you have the adoption of the Fed and a lot of these other economic changes. So the 100 years before 1913, the rate of economic growth was 3.5%, and since then it's been 3.2%, right? And most people said, well, so what? What difference does that make? Just 0.3 of 1. Well, actually, if you run that over the period of time we're talking about, a century, it means that we, again, because of the mathematics involved, that we would be 2 or 4 times better off if we had maintained the higher rate of economic growth. So I think what you had since the New Deal, or from the 1930s until about the 1970s, right, things began to change. You got more income inequality. And sort of more economic growth after the 1970s and into the 1980s. But that period, sort of the New Deal years, were one in which the principal goals were not growth, but stability, not entrepreneurship, but security. A period in which large, sort of slow-moving organizations dominated the American economy. This again, the description that I gave of the banking industry is one in which banking was not one for sort of buccaneering, sort of swashbuckling, risk-taking entrepreneurs, but rather was about being really careful and conservative. And a lot of big American economic organizations were like that. I think that also another factor in this, what made that possible for at least as long as we had it, was World War II. And the fact that our principal economic competitors, the Germans and the Japanese, were, in ashes. And we enjoyed a period of insulation from foreign competition That was the only thing that made this whole thing possible, right? American automakers could afford to give higher wages and benefits to United Auto Workers. They would just pass the cost of those on to the American consumer. And what choice did the American consumer have? You couldn't buy a Japanese car in the 1950s. When that began to change in the late 60s and early 70s, I think that factor of global competition more than anything else, made this the New Deal model impossible. Right? So just those 2 points are that if you look at the growth rates in the New Deal period, they're really not. They're historically lower, not higher, and that's because the concern was about redistribution and security rather than growth. I mean, these are questions, I suppose, for in terms of sort of ethics and philosophy. Labor unions are a good example of this. Somebody mentioned before, Elliot, you mentioned sort of the Hobbesian system where everyone seems to be trying to fix this system so that they can get something at somebody else's expense, but you're actually yourself worse off from that system, right? For a long time, advocates of organized labor said, unions are good for all workers, even the unorganized. Well, most people don't even sort of make that argument anymore because it's untenable. But even the argument that union workers are themselves better off because of pro-union laws turns out not to be true either. Economists have made the argument that everyone's worse off, and even members of labor unions are worse off because of the macro effect that unions have on the economy, right? So I think that's what a lot of this is. This comes down to. Even if you yourself are better off under this system, you think you're actually worse off because we all suffer or all pay the cost of this system of rent seeking and of trying to use government power to promote our private interests. Sir.
One of the important antitrust disputes that we never hear anything about anymore is the supposed argument that Theodore Roosevelt had with his former vice president, that as I understand it, he used as the excuse for running against him and handing the republic over ultimately to Woodrow Wilson. Can you talk a little bit about what kind of dispute that was, and whether you think that was his real, the truth about his motivation in destroying the republic by allowing Woodrow Wilson to get it?
You mean Roosevelt and Taft?
Yeah, Taft.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, Theodore Roosevelt running against Taft, and thereby the election to Woodrow Wilson.
Right. And the instant case was the U.S. Steel acquisition of Tennessee Coal and Iron in 1907. And the book that I have coming out soon, I do call attention to that and say that was one of the factors that led to the breakup between Taft and Roosevelt, who had been great friends, very, very intimate friends before going into the 1912 election. And it's an amazing story that I never heard before very recently, but there was a financial panic, another one of these bank meltdowns in 1907. And one of these brokerage houses in New York owned a lot of stock in the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company. And in order to save that bank and to sort of restore the financial system, Roosevelt approved the acquisition of Tennessee Coal and Iron by U.S. Steel, right? And U.S. Steel was the biggest steel producer in the United States, and they were very careful about acquiring other companies because they were afraid of being prosecuted under the antitrust laws. So Roosevelt pretty much said to them, don't worry about it. I promise we won't go after you for this acquisition. And they picked up Tennessee Coal and Iron for a price that, again, historians have disputed this, but it was the bargain of the century. They paid something like, $40 million for a company that was worth, $400 million or something like that. Then when Taft became president, he instituted the suit that Roosevelt said that he wouldn't pursue, and that was and made Roosevelt look bad, and Taft didn't handle it very well, and that was one of the things that led to the breakup between them. And that suit was continued through the Wilson administration. Ultimately, U.S. Steel prevailed. They were found not guilty in 1919, but that was one of the reasons for their that great friendship breaking up. The political consequences being, as you said, splitting the Republican Party and getting Woodrow Wilson elected president. But the really interesting thing is that Wilson went into office claiming that Roosevelt, this is sort of typical of the way in which Roosevelt was actually in favor of big business and just wanted to manage them and regulate them once they had become big. Wilson, again, Brandeis was sort of his chief mentor about this, because Wilson hadn't thought very much about these economic issues before he became president, was that we want to prevent business from becoming big in the first place. It's really not an antitrust policy so much as it is, well, what Brandeis called it was, you don't want to regulate big business, you want to regulate competition so that you don't produce bigness in the first place. And that was the chief issue between the two candidates in 1912. But because the basic point was Wilson and Brandeis didn't know what they were talking about economically. They had this, again, sort of 19th century idea that if business is big, it must be because they're doing something bad, right? And well, that's a very sort of popular feeling. Some people think, well, if Bill Gates has $40 billion, nobody can get $40 billion, honestly, right? He must be doing something wrong. So this kind of suspicion that just people had about bigness, that there must be something wrong if it was big, that was the idea that these guys still had. And it took a long time before historians, I think, learned the lessons of economists, that wasn't the reason why business becomes big, that there are certain, in certain industries, there are reasons why you're going to have a small number of large producers, right? It's not going to be possible to have a highly decentralized auto manufacturing industry, right? Automobile repair, on the other hand, you're going to have a large number of small competitors, right? Try as you might, right? You could monopolize the cigarette manufacturing industry as the Dukes did, right? People tried really hard to monopolize or centralize the cigar manufacturing business, but it just didn't work, right? Tom McCraw, I think he just passed away, although he's still alive and well. A historian at Harvard has written a lot about this, about sort of the economics of regulation that make these points. Sure.
I just had a quick question about, Thomas Paine made some comments in his pamphlet, Common Sense, about factions, and I wondered if you'd comment on that, please.
Tom Paine and Common Sense about faction? I don't recall that. So, no.
It seems to me, in fact, we did have a relatively decentralized automobile manufacturing in the 20s. And automobile manufacturers, from the all up into the Midwest and upstate New York, and by the, I guess, 50s, they were down to 2 or 3 or 4. But what led to that centralization of the automobile industry?
Well, again, people come up with more efficient ways of producing automobiles that require larger capital to get the business started. So, yeah, most industries start out with a large number of competitors, and then there's a shakeout as the more efficient, more innovative ones. Again, if there are certain sort of economic factors that drive, if there is, again, economies of scale and scope and things like this, large, expensive managerial things being necessary that make it very expensive to produce the first car, right? But then once you produce the first car, to produce the billionth car is very little, on the margin. In some industries like that, oil refining, automobile manufacturing, steel making, things like that, at certain, most of this is driven by sort of technological change. You're going to end up with unless you do something to artificially, unless you use the power of the government to try to maintain a larger number of producers, and a lot of times Americans have done that, you'll end up with that kind of structure, because you see it's the same in Japan, it's the same in Germany, it's the same, again, if you're able to factor out the political distortions in this, you end up with a similar kind of industrial structure at a given level of technology all over the world. But as I've been trying to say in this talk, we've done both. We've tried, on the one, there have been government policies that have abetted industries becoming more concentrated than they otherwise would be. And I think that's what DoddFrank is doing right now to the banking industry. But historically, we've also done the opposite, and government policy has as often as not, tried to prevent efficient businesses from becoming bigger. That was the big issue in antitrust, and the reason why American antitrust law didn't work the way that a lot of its advocates wanted to was that ultimately most businesses get bigger because they're more efficient, and the consumer benefits from that, And as much as the American people don't like bigness, right, and are suspicious of it, they realize that ultimately they're better off as consumers because of it. This is why Brandeis is such an interesting figure. Brandeis was opposed to bigness for all these reasons. Brandeis was also opposed to what today would call a consumer economy. If you were to tell Brandeis, well, actually, these businesses are actually bigger because they're more efficient, he would have said, well, so much the worse then, because then they're just giving people more stuff that they shouldn't have anyway. Right? Now, I'm sure they said, Brandeis is such a fascinating figure. He had this idea, sort of a really classical view, that the good life was really Spartan. And Brandeis was himself, sort of famous for his, he didn't approve of spectator sports. He was really, sort of thrifty and opposed to luxury in a way that sort of classical political thinkers were, right? That virtue requires a kind of sacrificing yourself for the public good, and not. He didn't like the way that America was developing, and again, towards a sort of consumer society. Today. So if you think that people are better off if they have more stuff at lower prices, then what I'm saying makes sense. But there are people who don't like that. Not many, but a few people who are still like that. Sure.
From kind of broader perspective, if I could argue that we're in almost a post-constitutional era, some large percentage of the people surrounding this building have no clue of the history you just addressed. What difference does the Constitution make, written a couple hundred years ago? How, and we're better and brighter and more educated today, and so we can usher in a brave new world however we design that. How are you attempting, or is Hillsdale or other folks attempting to address that, to help that kind of person understand why the things that you discussed today are important, and to understand why the Constitution and how the country was formed and so on and so forth is important, when so much of the population, one, has no clue, and they certainly don't believe that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is a way in which, if you say, well, you could make the argument that we've departed so much from the principles of the Constitution that even the effort to restore some traditional constitutional principles might do more harm than good, right? And again, I'm thinking of Michael Greva's book, The Upside Down Constitution, where conservatives like the principle of federalism, for example, right? And the idea of restoring power to the states is considered a conservative position, right? It's liberals who are the centralizers. Conservatives are in favor of what used to be called states' rights. And Greva's point is that, well, actually, the states are as bad as the federal government. In some ways, they're worse than the federal government. And they have what we see in the 20th century is the states seem to be conceding more and more power to the federal government against their own interests, right? Why would the states' legislatures have ratified the 17th Amendment and removed from themselves the power to choose the senators, right? That seems like a remarkable act of self-abnegation. Why would they have approved the Income Tax Amendment? To give the federal government this, the principal source of revenue to increase its powers. And Greva's argument is because the states recognize that even a stronger federal government would enhance their ability to engage in this kind of behavior. And that's something that up until very recently had never occurred to me, and really just changed the whole way that I thought about federalism. So I think that for my own bailiwick anyway of history is sort of to provide the alternative examples. To show the way, how we got to where we are today. And the question of whether, as a matter of fact, behind whatever's left of the formal Constitution, the way the system actually operates today. Work that a lot of my colleagues are doing in sort of development of the administrative state, for instance. It's good to study the Constitution and understand the way that the framers actually thought the system was going to work and the way that it did work for a long time. But we also have to recognize that for a couple of decades now, what my students and my children still look at on paper as the constitutional structure really is kind of beside the point. Instead, it is this enormous delegation of powers by Congress to these bureaucracies, these administrative agencies, and they're the ones who actually make the laws and run the country. Again, Greva calls it the upside-down Constitution. With regard to federalism, we have completely inverted the way the framers of the Constitution thought the system would work, and that could go as well for the separation of powers and a lot of other constitutional principles.
We have time for one more.
Yes, hi. The purpose of DoddFrank was to prevent systemic failure.
Yeah.
And yet it seems to me, maybe you could comment on this, that it will actually do the inverse because you have more concentration of larger banks because those are too big to fail. And at the same time, the smaller mid-sized banks have to conform to an incredibly complex set of restrictions and regulations. And I'm just wondering, I don't know where to go from this, what the question is in that. This is a statement. But
How do they pass it?
well, what if anything can be done to fix this situation, at least intellectually, if not, can't be done politically right at this point?
Yeah, and again, in the history of banking regulation, that's the story over and over again. And you say, well, the Fed is supposed to prevent, the original Federal Reserve Act in 1913, panics and meltdowns. And we got one after World War I. And the big one that we got in 1929, Herbert Hoover didn't come to this point until very late in the campaign, but he did say, he said, don't forget, by the way, the Fed was a democratic creation, Woodrow Wilson and his friends, right? And the Fed, I think a lot of it is still very much disputed, but a lot of economists would say the Fed was responsible for the severity and the length of the Great Depression. And the result was that in 1935, the Fed was given even more power by Congress. So the story over and over again is, nothing succeeds like failure in terms of bank regulation and policy. Screw the system up and you're going to get more power. And that happens over and over again in regulation. M. Stanton Evans, a journalist, he forget the name that he gave to this. The syndrome of regulatory failure ends up being the cause of more regulation, right? Another economist named Deepak Lal calls it the dirigiste dogma. Dirigisme being the French term for this idea of government managing and regulating the economy, that there's a problem, government does something to solve the problem, makes it worse, and that becomes the reason for further government intervention. So how you reverse or get out of that cycle is very difficult to say. Well, the original Constitution was meant to do that. One of the things that the Constitution was meant to do was to limit the ability of the states by establishing this federal system, right? The Commerce Clause for its first 100 years would be a great illustration of that. It wasn't that Congress was regulating the economy through using the commerce power that it had. Congress did almost nothing. Rather, it was the courts who used the commerce power to prevent the states from interfering in interstate commerce, right? So one of the great things that the Constitution did was to prevent the states to minimize this kind of behavior that I've been talking about. Now, today I would be very hesitant to say, well, we need some kind of international organization to take care of what has now become a national problem. But there was a moment when the Constitution was formed that you were able to institute some structural features to reverse this process and to actually provide for an economic improvement and growth. So I don't have any answers. As a historian, we can't say much about the future. And usually, you ask a historian, how do you get to where you're going? The first thing he's going to say is, well, I wouldn't start from here, right? All I can explain is how you got here, not how you're going to get out.